It is part 4 of our cube data analysis. Today we dig through what cube designers can learn from the data, and we tackle you all's questions that the first 3 videos have inspired. Welcome to Cultic Cube, where we cube religiously. We make you better at cube, and make your cube better. Today I want to talk about how we can evaluate card quality in the cubes. Using our data, can we make claims about the abstract success or desirability of individual cards? Then we'll perform a similar sort of analysis for archetype. Ultimately, we'll use the ideas we develop here as ways of gauging new cards and mechanics from the recently spoiled Zendikar Rising. If you are just tuning into our series, well, you are missing a lot. I recommend starting at part 1. To contextualize today's discussion, allow me to clarify some questions from earlier entries in the series. I want to unpack what a card's deck wins ranking means, as when we have reported things such as Quarantine Field led to the most wins among white cards in the Cultic Cube. We have tried to avoid saying things such as Quarantine Field is the best white card. The data do not allow us to make such definitive claims. What they do allow us to say is that Quarantine Field was main decked in more decks that won more games than any other single white card in the cube. My friend Derek Gallen, who writes about Cube for Hipsters of the Coast, made the good observation that in Retail Limited, the card Overrun may appear to overperform, as it is very often the last spell cast in a game. This obscures the fact that the card may, in other games, languish in hand, because one's board state never develops to a sufficiently advantaged position. That is, it is possible for a card to be mediocre, or perhaps even bad, but nevertheless it may appear to be a format all-star, as whenever the card resolves, it seems to win the game. Derek wondered if Fire Blast, which was the card with the highest deck wins ranking in Cultic, might experience a similar bias. It is perfectly possible that Fire Blast is often the last spell cast in a game, and therefore leaves an outsized impression in people's minds. However, our deck wins data metric does not engage with people's perception of spells. These data reflect the success of decks that mainboarded Fire Blast, without reference to whether Fire Blast was even cast. What our data tell us about Fire Blast is not then analogous to the Overrun issue. All we can claim about Fire Blast is that it was put in decks that had a high average game win rate. Along these lines, we've gotten many questions, such as, is card X good? Or, is card Y bad? The single card that has raised the most eyebrows is Oko. You may recall that Oko's deck wins rating was comparatively middling in Cultic, where he appears at the bottom of the second quartile. The Dekkaru cube declined to run Oko. Is Oko secretly worse than we thought? Again, we can make no claim about the abstract value of Oko, but I have a few observations, which do not necessarily rely on the data. For starters, I am firm in the conviction that Oko is outstanding. Furthermore, it has been my experience that Oko is excellent against aggro, so one might have expected the card to have helped shore up games against red and white aggro, and perhaps indeed he did. My suspicion is that Oko contributed to fewer victories than we might expect, for some combination of the following reasons. First, the data show that Oko was the second most frequently first-picked card. Many people, aware of his power level, may have consequently committed to Simic colors from the get-go. Parker explored this idea in our third video when he tracked how likely people were to cleave to their first pick, when they might have done better to have been more agile and to have drafted the hard way. Marrying one's first pick is still more dangerous when the pick is multicolored. Second, people may have splashed Oko too liberally, thereby damaging their mana base, and/or rendering Oko uncastable until the stars aligned. Third, people may have been introducing Oko into 4 and 5 color decks, of the sort that fared remarkably poorly overall in Cultic. Nevertheless, I put it to you that a turn 2 Oko, indeed any of the cube's walkers on turn 2, is a very strong play, though not, as we saw, an unbeatable one. Comparing the win rates of cards across Cultic and Dekkaru helps demonstrate that card evaluation is inseparable from environment. Our 2 cubes had 217 cards in common, or about 40% of their pools. As you may recall, I mentioned briefly in our second video that some shared cards, such as counterspells, led to substantially higher deck wins in Cultic than in Dekkaru. Let's drill down just a bit on this idea. The 3 cards that had the most wins in Dekkaru compared to Cultic were Cryptbreaker, Dauntless Bodyguard, and Vryn Wingmare. Cryptbreaker makes sense, as the card's main use in Cultic was as an enabler for Reanimator, which was a strategy that underperformed. In contrast, Dekkaru supported black aggro, which was one of the format's top decks. This inflates our perception of Cryptbreaker's performance in Dekkaru. The white aggro card's presence here should not be understood to signal that white aggro was bad in Cultic. On the contrary, it was a winning deck, but rather that it was a dominant strategy in Dekkaru. Thus we conclude that these fluctuations in performance of individual cards are profoundly influenced by the performance of archetypes and deck strategies. The 3 cards associated with the largest increase of deck wins in Cultic versus Dekkaru are Treasure Cruise first, followed by Saheeli, Sublime Artificer, and Logic Knot. This difference is likely another indication of the fact that blue decks performed better in Cultic than in Dekkaru, which is an idea we have explored via other metrics in earlier videos. The win rate deltas at the margins average 18% difference. That is, Treasure Cruise led to 18% more wins in Cultic than in Dekkaru. When we look at the dead center of the spread, for those cards whose win rate contribution was most nearly identical in the 2 cubes, we find Arc Lightning, Llanowar Elves, and Elspeth Sun's Champion. The burn spell was in the first quartile of deck wins ranking in both cubes, while the latter 2 cards were in the second quartile. These are cards that are always good, in a variety of archetypes, or in Elspeth's case, a best-in-slot card whose payoff is consistently high. As usual, we should not put much store in the cards named here, or in their relative ranking. The important point is that an individual card's win rate contribution can only be discussed in terms of a particular environment, and indeed in terms of a particular metagame. Let's move on to larger scale design issues. Collaborator Jett Crowdis has done awesome work charting how accurately people valued cards by color in both cubes by comparing event winners' picks against the picks of those who did not go 3-0. We can use color identity as a very coarse proxy for macro archetype in certain instances. Red, for example, is very much an aggro color, though its many burn spells can slot into many other decks. Some viewers have asked whether aggro was an overpowered strategy in the cubes. These data don't answer that, but they do allow us to make some observations about people's card preferences, and these inform the strength of various strategies. Red and white tended to be undervalued in both cubes by players who were less successful. The data track with macro-archetypical performance and show where the metagame has room for adjustment. In a metagame that evolved over a longer period of time, people would presumably learn to value proactive colors and strategies better, such that evaluative disparities would tend towards 0. In such a process, the performance of various archetypes would perforce shift as well. The fact that aggro did well in both cubes is clear. There are a huge number of factors that can contribute to this, and I'll offer a number of ideas that I cannot prove and that are not mutually exclusive. Hypothesis number 1 is that aggro was over-supported in both cubes, such that red or white had too many one-drop creatures, for instance, despite calibration informed by hypergeometric analysis. Hypothesis 2 is that aggro cards were broadly undervalued in a way that might ultimately be mutable over time, as we discussed a moment ago. Hypothesis 3 is that people are generally averse to drafting aggro, with the result that more people are fighting over mid-range, control, or combo cards than aggressive ones, which thus increases deck quality for the relatively few aggro drafters. Hypothesis 4 is that aggro is a linear strategy that may be easier to draft, build, and pilot than other strategies. It is almost certainly true that in Dekkaru, there is more redundancy for the white aggro deck than for the Chromantic Lantern and Golos Tireless Pilgrim deck, for example. When we consider tens of thousands of games, linear, proactive strategies may have an edge simply by virtue of being more reliable than other decks. My friend Andy Mangold sums up our analytical conundrum nicely when he observes, "This data is a much better indicator of what people like and want to do than what is successful." So I won't speak for Gwen here, but the astucity of Andy's observation means I am not ready to conclude that Aggro is overpowered in a fundamentally broken way in Cultic. Nevertheless, I do believe that the data suggest that many MTGO drafters are reluctant to play Aggro. This may be thanks to an aversion to the strategy, a lack of appreciation for the power of the strategy, a feeling of guilt at playing the role of the so-called fun police, or a disinclination to spend money to play lean and linear decks. I sympathize much more now with WOTC's much-decried design decision to keep cutting back support for aggressive strategies in the flagship MTGO Vintage and Legacy cubes. As cube designers, one of our responsibilities is to give our players what they want. Let's move on to a less successful strategy. I've had lots of questions about Reanimator, which, people observe, performed poorly in both cubes. Let me first address a common misunderstanding about Dekkaru, which arose, I believe, from the fact that Dread Return was one of Dekkaru's black cards that was most weakly associated with deck wins. When people learned this in our second video, many naturally inferred that Reanimator did poorly, or they wondered if Dread Return was a bad card. However, I suggest that Reanimator wasn't actually a supported archetype. Gwen was running some additional reanimation effects, such as Unearth, Whip of Erebos, and Phyrexian Reclamation. But these were meant to be value reanimation effects, or synergistic addenda to self-mill or hellbent strategies, not cogs in a dedicated reanimation package. Cultic, by contrast, did have a deep complement of reanimation effects, and these decks did not, in fact, do well. For the reasons you know all too well by now, it is impossible to say whether Reanimator, or creature cheat broadly, was bad in the environment. One could imagine the metagame shifting in such a way that Reanimator became the deck to beat, particularly if Aggro were more contested. Nevertheless, it is my suspicion that Reanimator needs help. As you may recall from my descriptions of the environment, I calibrated creature cheat spells to 4 and sometimes 5 CMC. I did, however, allow cheaper cheating creatures, such as Coffin Queen and Volrath's Shapeshifter, as these tend to be slow and fragile. What I absolutely did not want was games to end on turn 2 with Animate Dead into an arbitrary cheat target. In fact, I wanted games to conclude no sooner than turn 4. Thus, I gated the speed of the reanimation spells, though not the discard spells. In the end, I suspect that 4 CMC is a turn too slow, but notice that the data do not allow me to prove this. I'm not sure how to address this issue. My friends Andy Mangold and Anthony Maddox graciously invited me to their Lucky Paper radio podcast to discuss this data analysis project. When we touched on Reanimator, I joked that I might add 8 copies of Necromancy to the cube. The problem, of course, is that there are all too few reanimation spells at 3 CMC. I really do not want to run 2 CMC reanimation spells, such as Dance of the Dead, as these are too quick to come online. Recurring Nightmare, while a 3, is too broken a card for this environment. Improving cheat targets does not help a great deal when the issue is the speed at which they may be deployed, and when the targets are quite good already. Making reanimation spells cheaper, but their targets worse, is not the answer either. Even running out something dorky like a Palaka Worm on turn 2 reduces interaction by demanding that the opponent have an answer quite soon. I do not have an answer to this conundrum, and I must say I'm leaning toward cutting the cheat package entirely, in favor of a black aggro package and deeper support for mid-range of the Racing Green model. Many of you have asked about my take on contributor Ryan Saxe's article about Cultic that he wrote for Star City Games. Therein he argues that it is often correct to build decks that run much lighter on lands than limited players are accustomed to, on the order of 12 lands, rather than 17 in the example that he carefully develops. I have been asked whether the data bear out Ryan's thesis. Unfortunately, our data do not allow us to answer the question. I can say that the format was designed to allow drafters to cut lands viciously in many archetypes. Aggressive decks can play remarkably low to the ground. Base green decks have access to the entire complement of dorks, and control decks have a huge density of inexpensive cantrips available to find land drops. I don't doubt that the gap between some players' expectations of limited magic deck building imperatives and the more spell-rich decks that Cultic rewards led to some number of losses until people adjusted their heuristics. In just a moment, we will apply our data to speculation about how good Zendikar Rising's new category of card will prove to be for Cube. Allow me to pause for a moment to remind you that Cultic Cube videos and the Chateau Cube podcast are supported by you. You can join me via Patreon, which gets you access to all sorts of cool bonuses. Also, any purchases that you make via my affiliate links for TCG Player, Inked Gaming, or Amazon help me out at no additional cost to you. See the video description for links. Thanks. Our data concerning cheap cantrips and Cultic allow us to hypothesize about the value of modal double-faced cards, or MDFC, that Zendikar Rising introduces. I'd like to take as a test case Jwari Disruption, which is a new spin on Censor. Censor can cycle, and cheap cycling is incredibly valuable. Alan Comer had this insight over 15 years ago when he pioneered xerox theory, which leverages the smoothing effect of cantrips to trim lands from a deck and thereby increase its spell density. Cultic allows one to employ xerox to fine effect. If you stretch your mind back to the first video in this series, you will recall that cards with cycling were features of decks that performed very well. As it happens, Humble Censor is the blue card that has the highest correlation with deck wins. Again, this does not perforce mean that Censor is an amazing card, but it figured in more winning decks than any other blue card. Cheap cyclers are so very good because they decrease variance in Magic, which tends to be the enemy of tight play. Early in the game, one typically cycles in order to look for lands. Later in the game, the cycling card is, one hopes, more useful as the spell that it has on its face, though it has the upside that it can be discarded to dig for something that is more situationally relevant. Xerox theory trades on such flexibility and suggests the calculus that about 3 cards that cycle for 1 or 2 mana can replace 1 land in a deck. These new MDFC are just totally insane because they sidestep such calculation. They are definitionally either the land or the spell already, without requiring any careful calibration of cycler to land ratio. Similar to a creature land, these allow one to load up an extra spell in a land slot, a slot which might otherwise be air, the necessary but more or less inherently unproductive atmosphere in which a game plan grows and thrives. One might argue that the uncommon MDFC are worse for entering tapped. I agree. That doesn't make them bad, though. Censor requires that one pay a blue mana to cycle it. If one accepts that the most common use case for cycling is to dig for land, then the fact that Jwari Disruption enters tapped is an extremely similar cost. After all, tapping a blue source to pay Censor's cycling cost is close to playing a blue source that enters tapped. And importantly, while cycling draws a card off the top of the library, the MDFC is guaranteed to be that land that the cycler hopes to hit in this scenario. The fact that these two spells are force spikes does highlight the strengths of cycling over MDFC. Often a force spike is a miserable card in the mid to late game, and the land may be no better. In such a case, the fact that Censor's cycling as a redraw is better, but I suspect that on average, the MDFC is still the better card for occupying a land slot rather than a third of a land slot. And the larger point is that even the MDFC that enter tapped are, I think, just exceptionally good, even when their spell effect looks pretty marginal. A final note is that I maintain that the analysis above holds true for creatures as well, even creatures that may not fire the imagination. Curator of Mysteries, who was in Cultic, was snubbed in drafting and deck building, which I fully understand. It's a French vanilla 4/4 for 4 with some trinket text about cycling that is mainly additive distraction. But this card was a feature of winning decks at a higher rate than its public perception might imply. I suspect that this was thanks to the card's flexibility. It cycles for a blue mana, or it's an air elemental body. Hence, I expect that even somewhat marginal-looking creatures such as Umara Wizard will be fine includes. Early on, it's a land. Later, it's not. That's crazy. I entirely sympathize with those who complain that lands that enter tapped are less than desirable. But my experience is that cycling 1 is quietly excellent, and the ETB tapped land with a spell on the back is not only comparable to the cycler in many ways, but is, in fact, often preferable. We've covered a lot of ground here, but let me try to pull out some of the cube design lessons that I have learned from these data. A first thing is that access to a huge amount of data is amazing, but it nevertheless does not provide magical answers to what is abstractly good or bad, correct or incorrect. None of us should feel obliged to make particular changes or to modify our philosophical approach to cube thanks to the results that we see here. Let us continue to allow space for intuition and experience to inform our evolving designs. Second, context matters enormously. Cultic and Dekkaru share many features, including general power level, and indeed 40% of their card pool. Nevertheless, individual cards can play out quite differently within each environment. This is true even for cards that are not narrow enablers, but rather are generic role players, such as Counterspell. Cards and strategies that I find to be good or bad may behave very differently for you. Let us all be a little more humble when evaluating one another's environments. Third, metagame matters a great deal. Our data gave us a snapshot of how one, particularly large, group of people behaved in a pretty narrow window of time. Our data have less to do with what is actually good and more with what this group of drafters likes. Let us design with a meta in mind. Thanks again to WOTC for providing access to this data and allowing us to present analysis of it. Thanks to my friends Gwen Dekker, Parker, Jett Crowdis, and Ryan Saxe for their contributions to this project. And thanks so much to you for seeing this journey through with me. Let's keep hanging out and chatting Cube.